Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. We are tenure-track faculty members in the sciences, working at a primarily undergraduate university in California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss. Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Claire, and today we are continuing our interview episode where our listener Darien interviews me. Last week, we talked about kind of the transition between graduate school research focus and my professor position now, where it's a teaching focus. And this episode, we're going to continue and kind of talk about the intersection between research and teaching, and then talk about teaching philosophies. So without further ado, let's get back into the interview.
So you are a Cottrell scholar. I actually heard about this not from your podcast, but in a different venue. And that award or that community is really cool because it's an award for people who have shown that they're both really good scholars and also really good teachers. So my first question to you, Claire, is how does being a teacher influence your scholarship?
Okay, yeah. I feel like I kind of have to answer both angles of this at the same time because they really, teaching and scholarship kind of intermingle so much for me. So, and as I was thinking about this concept, I realized they intermingle even more than I thought they did. So anyway, in classes, I usually bring examples in from my research, and I think that's really helpful for my students to see that this is real. You know, people actually use this information we're learning to do real science. So I find that that's helpful. And then I think my research students really benefit as students and learners from being part of a bigger research project where we're funded, and, you know, so it's someone besides me thought this was worth doing. I think it really makes it more meaningful for them as learners. They're part of something bigger. So that's the first thing I would say. And then a couple other things. My teaching, I've been teaching analytical chemistry classes, so I've really kind of solidified my analytical chemistry skills through teaching, and that's been helpful for my research. And then thinking as a researcher in a scholarly way helps me think about whether changes that I'm making to my classes are working or not, and thinking more analytically about that. And then just kind of a specific example, I teach a lot of science writing in my instrumental analysis class, and having taught and really diced down, here's how you write an abstract. Then when I write my own abstracts, I think I've actually gotten better at writing abstracts because I've improved the structure of my own abstracts with that. And then on the other hand, when I'm writing my own papers and I'm throwing some of the rules that I teach my students out the window, I'm like, oh, maybe that's not something that should be taught, or at least I'm thinking about these rules that I'm teaching them. So I think teaching and research are all really connected.
Okay. So you kind of see that the teacher scholarship dichotomy is not a dichotomy at all. They are kind of interwoven very intimately with each other.
I do find that. Like, if it's easy to separate them and think of them separately, but often when I'm thinking of them separately, I end up thinking of the other one just by happenstance.
Is that part of what it means to be Claire? Or
good question.
Is that, do you think the profession writ large kind of has that intermingling?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it is interesting that we have, like, the professor position, whatever university you're at, usually has teaching and research, some balance between those. So why do we put those together if not because they have some connection? I mean, you could say that the reason we put them together is simply because if you're researching a field, you know a lot about it, and so you could teach about it. That makes sense. But then why would we have our teaching-focused people also do research? Well, maybe so that they're still current with the field and they can still teach modern things. That makes sense. Yeah, I guess I would say my thought is, for me, definitely they're connected, but I think I'm sure that for some people they're connected less strongly than for others, but I think that probably for everybody they're connected at least a little bit. There's some overlaps.
Yeah. So my current research is kind of at the interface of chemistry and physics and material science engineering.
Cool.
So very not within the traditional confines of what it means to be chemistry. Whereas it seems like your research is very very run-of-the-mill analytical chemistry. I'm not saying that I'm not saying the problems you're attacking are run-of-the-mill, but like the techniques, for instance, are
Okay.
more something that you would actually teach an undergraduate about in like an undergraduate class. Is that, do you think that that's a conscious choice by you to kind of pick a research topic that is within the confines of traditional subdiscipline? Or do you have maybe colleagues who choose not to do that and have to spend a lot more time teaching their undergraduates how to work at this interface instead of using skills they may have learned in classes?
Yeah, good question. I guess I would say that although we use analytical chemistry techniques to analyze metals in seawater, students don't really learn a lot of the things that are fundamental to those analytical problems in the classroom, you know? Certainly the chemistry majors don't know necessarily the oceanographic or the environmental side, which is very interrelated. As far as the analytical stuff goes, you know, we talk about some particular aspects of the method, but we don't really talk about, you know, it's a very particular method that was kind of pieced together with a bunch of different things to answer this very particular analytical challenge. So, while of course students can build on stuff that they've learned in my analytical classes in order to understand this particular method, it would be very new to them as well to learn it. So I don't think I really chose, I mean, definitely I'm still kind of continuing the work that I did in grad school, and so I didn't necessarily choose this method thinking about the undergraduates. It was just the one that I had been using and I'm continuing to use. I am finding, like I said earlier, that it just takes so long to be trained on that method that really limits the number of students who can actually get data in the lab. And so I am kind of now maybe more intentionally reaching out to complementary methods that would get us complementary data that could be done with less training. Again, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's like straight out of the textbook class stuff that they've already learned. I'm sure, like, I think probably for any research project, you take some stuff that you've already learned and then you have to learn new stuff related to that particular topic. So I think that would still apply, but it would just be a little more accessible. Yeah, is that answering your question?
Yeah, it is. I actually, I think your answer made me realize that my question was actually not fair to your research, because I think one of the things you were saying is that the methods that you use are far enough away from, you know, sophomore textbook analytical chemistry that it is almost as if your students have no training in that specific area. So maybe it's fair to say that most modern research groups will be doing things at the cutting edge, which are not in textbooks. And therefore, undergraduate students will always need to piece together an understanding that they didn't have already from their classes?
I think so. I often hear undergraduates chatting in the lab about how they want to do research and they want to reach out to a faculty member and ask if they can do research, but they're afraid of making some mistake in the email about the faculty member's research. And I always respond like, we can't expect you to understand our particular research area initially, And so I think that's, I'm sure that there's certain research projects that are more able to build off of the class work than others, but I think for all of them, you'd have to learn some specific stuff.
Yeah.
So I haven't found that to be a problem.
Little do these undergrads know that sometimes we don't even know what we're doing with our research. So, yeah, like my graduate school projects, evolved extremely heavily over the course of 5 years, such that the projects I was working on at the very end looked nothing like the projects I was working on at the start of grad school.
The best laid plans. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And I think with your, like you were talking about, your research is kind of at the intersection of a bunch of different fields. And so people would have to learn a lot of stuff to join in. But I don't think that would be a problem. I think that might actually be really exciting for students. And you could get students from the different intersecting fields to be excited about the other fields and learn a little bit about the other fields and bring their own expertise. I think that could be really, really cool and powerful.
Yeah. Do you find that all of these students that work with you are chemistry majors? Or...
No, definitely not.
Okay.
I've had a lot of oceanography majors, of course, but then so I'm kind of at the intersection between oceanography and chemistry, I would say. And so, I get a lot of oceanography and chemistry majors, but then I also get botany majors, sometimes biology majors. It kind of varies. Often they take the class and we see if they're interested in the general concepts of analytical chemistry, or I hear from some other faculty member that there's this oceanography person who's interested in doing some kind of chemical oceanography thing, and so then maybe I reach them that way. So it's kind of just a matter of whether their interests are at all aligned with this particular project and whether we run into each other.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a series of questions about the idea of teaching philosophy. So, if I go to a bunch of universities' websites, or if I go to like Chemical and Engineering News and look through the ads for these universities wanting to hire new professors, they always, well, not always, but they usually ask for a one-page teaching philosophy document. And I've thought to myself about, what my teaching philosophy might be. But I'm very curious to know how your teaching philosophy has changed from maybe the idealistic views of you starting your position to now you are tenured and all those fancy things. How has your teaching philosophy evolved over the 5 or 6 years? How, like, if you were to apply to a job, would you use the same document when you applied 5 or 6 years ago, or would it look nothing like it?
Great question. Well, I guess there are pieces that I would take and pieces that I would drop. So I went back and reread my teaching philosophy, and I was surprised to find a couple things that I'd written in there that I hadn't even realized I thought of back then that I still do regularly now. So, like, I have an example of talking with students in the lab of, if you get base on your hands, you should still wash it off, even though it just feels soapy, because actually your hands are turning into soap. And I used that as an example of a relatable thing that you could tell them that maybe would help the material be interesting and have it stick beyond the exam, as an example of like trying to make the material relatable. And I had just totally forgotten that I thought of it back as a grad student, or I happened upon it, as a grad student, and it seemed to resonate with the students, so I kept doing it, and I've been doing it every year now. So so there's a couple things like that. Another one, like I think I maybe thought of while I was writing my teaching philosophy, was an idea for pre-lab assignments, where the students would have to come up with some mistake that somebody could make while going through the experiment, how that mistake would impact their final results, and whether they could somehow fix it after discovering the mistake. And that's what I do for my pre-labs, and I hadn't realized I thought of it back then. So those things I still like, and I still do. Relatable examples, and in particular that base one, I still use it. Pre-labs still use it. So so in some ways remarkably similar. But then there were some things that I just totally forgotten that I had written about and definitely don't do now. Some of them I still think are good ideas and maybe would be, they would be good learning experiences, but they just didn't really fit in the classes that I was teaching, or I didn't feel like I wanted to change the classes so much to make them fit in. So maybe I just haven't found the right class yet, or maybe they aren't as key to my teaching philosophy as I thought when I wrote it. But I guess my main things kind of remain the same, of about respecting the students and setting up an atmosphere where they're comfortable asking questions. And so that was kind of my main thing back then, and I still think it's true. And one thing I just wanted to mention, a note about writing teaching philosophies, maybe to people who don't have that much experience teaching classes of their own, because I'd never taught my own class when I wrote my teaching philosophy. But I definitely used my experience as a TA and a tutor, but I also developed my teaching philosophy kind of thinking of my experience as a student and what stood out to me to be effective and ineffective techniques. And we all have lots of experience as a student by the time we're in grad school, of course. So I knew what worked and didn't work for me, and I think that's a pretty good place to start. And of course, different people have different learning styles, and we shouldn't assume that everybody's learning style is the same as ours, but I think starting from what worked for me as a learner is a pretty good place to start. So I really appreciated as a learner when faculty members were respectful of the students in the classroom and kind of set it up so we could really be comfortable contributing our ideas, and so I try to do that.
Okay. Do you feel like you're not in the specific examples, but in like the philosophy, your teaching philosophy is like a broad concept. Do you feel like your teaching philosophy differs significantly from any of your colleagues?
Oh, that's a great question. So I haven't read my colleagues' teaching philosophies, but we do observe each other's classes as part of the retention tenure promotion process. So I've gotten to sit in on other people's classes, and it's interesting to see what works for different people. So I think it's really kind of awesome and really a great system that all the different faculty members can come up with what works for them as individuals, for their class, for how they like to teach, for their learning goals, and we can all decide the best ways to teach our own classes. So I think to some extent we all have the same goals. We all want our students to learn the material. We all want our students to be able to be successful regardless of their background, but we might emphasize different aspects of that or go about it in different ways. And so I like to set up the atmosphere where students feel comfortable speaking up, and it's fine with me if they speak up in the class or the lab or the email or office hours or whatever, as long as they have some way they're comfortable speaking up with their questions. I try to set that up. I focus on respecting my students. I also focus on trying to help them learn to be professional, like handing things on time, and I try to model professional behavior. And I'm sure to some extent all the faculty do that, but maybe have different things that we would emphasize in our teaching philosophies.
Yeah. Maybe, would you think that the term teaching philosophy is not a good term for the actual idea, but rather like teaching methods or teaching heuristics would be a more apt term? Because like what you have been telling me is, you have like these set of methods and maybe a few goals that you try to implement, and then your colleagues kind of have different methods or different, slightly different goals. So
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
like,
maybe you could say philosophy. We have different philosophies of how to achieve a successful classroom. I think I would be comfortable saying that. We all have similar goals, but different philosophies of how to achieve the goal. I don't know,
okay.
maybe you were getting at something that I missed.
No, I think I'm nitpicking about the term philosophy, I guess.
Okay.
So I know that Ruth really enjoys hanging out in the kind of teaching literature, and she's gone to conferences focused on, you know, teaching physics, for instance. So I'm wondering, for you, how has the academic literature how has the academic literature influenced like the way you teach or your teaching philosophy or your teaching methods? Like have you had any shifts in thinking over the last couple of years by interacting with Ruth or interacting with the academic literature on the topic?
Sure, yeah. I suppose the main way that I interact with the academic literature on teaching is through going to workshops or either on my own campus or elsewhere about teaching pedagogy. And so I kind of attend ones that seem interesting to me, and then I take the parts that resonate with me. And so I've gotten a lot of great ideas from the literature that way, and sometimes I hear an idea and it just isn't something that's going to work for me in the classroom. It doesn't fit with my teaching philosophy. And I think that's fine, as long as we're all working to improve our classes and are generally open to hearing alternatives, then I think it's totally okay to say this is not going to work for me. And I did have one more thought, thanks to Ralph, about the teaching philosophies that you were mentioning of course, there are some bad teaching philosophies, ineffective teaching philosophies out there. And so but if we're thinking about effective teaching philosophies, they might be quite similar and have different things we're emphasizing. But even if we're talking about good teaching philosophies and effective things, I think it's totally reasonable that some people would have things that work really well for them, and other people would say, "Oh, I don't think that's going to work for me in my classroom. I'll do something else to achieve that goal." So anyway, just as an example of that, I attended this active learning and analytical chemistry workshop a few summers back that I really liked, and they talked about how it's really difficult to take someone else's active learning activity and then use it ourselves. And even if we all want to do active learning and we all are talking about the same concept and we all have the same learning goals even, someone else might have a really boisterous personality and someone else might not, and it just might not be a good fit to take someone else's active learning activity and try to do it yourself. So we can't all do everything, and even if we could, we'd do it in different ways. So anyway, I think it's all about getting access to new ideas, hearing what's working for other people from Ruth, from colleagues, from the literature, from workshops, and then just choosing what's best to incorporate into our own classroom. So to kind of actually answer your question, the main time that I went into the academic literature on teaching myself was when I was writing my Cottrell Scholar Award proposal, and I had this idea for homework assignments that I thought would help improve equity and performance in my classroom, and I wanted to see if there was any basis in the literature for it. And so I read best practices for multicultural group work and helping students see the value in the material, how to help them do that, and how to help them have confidence they can learn the material. And anyway, it was I did find that really useful to see that there were studies supporting this idea I had, and reading the studies helped me refine the idea. So that's kind of my one experience so far of really using the literature on pedagogy, but I did find it really helpful.
Okay. I think I have just one more official question.
Okay.
So I had a colleague in graduate school who they and I would oftentimes talk about the maybe best thing to do for a lot of courses is to cut down the amount of concepts or the amount of modules in the course, and like do fewer concepts better.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you have any, insights into this when you're designing your own courses. Have you found that you have had to shrink down the amount of concepts that you want to put in a course, but that you're not going to be able to? Or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
do you think maybe some of your colleagues try to put too much into courses? So for me, where this came in is that I always felt like there was way too much information in the Gen Chem classes that I helped TA. I always felt like the information was just coming far too rapidly at students. So I'm just curious if you have any, wise advice or wise insight into this matter.
Yeah. Good. That's such a debate, is like depth versus breadth on content, I went to undergraduate school at Bates College in Maine, and the chemistry department there, I was a chemistry major, really focused on depth as opposed to breadth. And they even told us, like, we went to take the chemistry GRE, and they were like, we haven't covered a whole bunch of the stuff that's going to be on that, so it's going to be hard. And it was. But that was really the only time that I've noticed it being a problem that I didn't have that breadth. And, I would go off to an internship or something, and I don't know, maybe we hadn't covered something that would have been helpful to know, but it seemed like I was able to learn all the stuff that I needed to learn in whatever situation I was in. So I have never really found it to be a problem that I experienced that depth versus breadth. In my own classes, I have definitely noticed that I've been decreasing the amount of coverage over the years. I started out, this was what we were covering. I didn't want to shuffle from that, so I just stuck with that. But then as time went on, I had a better understanding of the course, and I was like, I think if we cut this, it's not really going to impact anything else we're trying to cover, and it's not really that important a concept to me, I don't think, so we'll cut that out, and then we'll have more time to spend on something else. So I think it's kind of been happening naturally that as I look at my lesson plan, I say, well, do they even need to know this? Let's just cut that out, and we can spend more time on some other things. And so, I think we can all look back on classes where we've completely forgotten lots of the concepts, and so I kind of anticipate that they will forget lots of the concepts, so who cares if we squeeze that extra little concept in that most of them are going to forget, when instead we could have really delved into something a little more deeply that maybe more of them would remember and would be more meaningful later, and maybe even more helpful later, because they can build on that with something else. So I still cover. I haven't been so bold as to just do like one big project for lab or anything like that, which is a cool idea. A whole semester of just one project, which is really the ultimate depth versus breadth thing. So I haven't quite gotten there. I still do lots of different lab experiments, and I still cover lots of chapters in the book, but I am moving towards less and less breadth and more depth, and I think I'm comfortable with that decision.
Okay. Do you feel like that decision is based a large part on the fact that one of the courses you teach is the end of the progression, and the other one is the one right before that course? So you have a lot of you don't have other faculties' courses leaning on your course to make sure that students know something.
That's a good point. And it certainly is, I know if I decided not to cover something in the class before the class that I'm teaching right now. And so I can even think about that when I'm deciding, can we cut this out? I can think about the next level of the class that I also teach and whether it would impact it there. So, yes, it's more easy for me to do that because I'm just teaching those last two courses in the sequence. However, I think what I might do in a different scenario is like go talk to the faculty member who teaches the next level and say, how big of a deal would it be if we cut this out? Would that influence you guys? Or what aspects of this do you really need them to know? And I think a lot of times, like we've kind of talked about this, I think Ruth brought this up on the podcast at one point, like it's helpful to communicate with the other connected classes. Like often we think about math and we're like, man, our students just should really know more math. How come these math people aren't doing their job? But oftentimes maybe they didn't even cover that concept in the class that we're thinking they covered it in. So I think I would say that if someone is worried about cutting out a piece of content, or if I was worried about cutting out a piece of content that might influence someone else, I would want to have a conversation with that person. And maybe there's other things that actually would be much more helpful for us to really work on more than that concept. And so, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely, when I was, an undergraduate student, I definitely experienced being in like a mathematics or a physics class and learning topic, and then going to a different class and that professor assuming I had learned that topic, which I had, but they had a very specific thing in their mind about that topic that was important. And, I never learned that in the other class. So, and I dealt with the same thing when I was teaching in graduate school as well. I taught as a TA physical chemistry thermodynamics, and there's a set of mathematical techniques that are used really widely in thermodynamics, which are technically calculus, but no calculus course ever covers them. Whereas a lot of chemistry professors think that they're covered in those calculus courses.
Yeah. So maybe the answer is more communication. So we know what is covered and what maybe then we could just cover the little bridge between what they do know about calculus and the thing that we need to talk about right here. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really good phrasing. Figuring out it's important to know where you need to build bridges, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, I think that those are my official questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Darien. It's been, thanks for your episode suggestion and for coming on the show to conduct the interview.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
And to end, I just want to remind our listeners that we're delighted to get episode ideas from you, and anything from topic ideas to suggestions of someone to interview to a recommended podcast that might be a good match for us to exchange episodes with. We'd love to hear about it, and you can reach us at contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. So thanks so much for listening. And Darien, thank you again. It's been really great doing this episode with you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people you know if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.